now Israel needs Adonai, the Lord of angel armies, right now on their behalf and throughout the nations as well. But he also needs warriors on the ground. And it's when the giant Goliath came against Israel, he taunted them and mocked them. The army of Israel was afraid, but David, the shepherd boy, the worshipper of Yahweh, the one who'd been trained on lions and bears, was not afraid of the big bad wolf, so to speak. It says in 1 Samuel 17 that then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel." There are current giants that are taunting Israel today. The IDF are David's with their slingshots, the tanks, the aircraft, the great weaponry that they have. That's also in need of the spiritual giants need dealing with behind this battle, needing the Davidic anointing, the worshippers and intercessors, and those that are in the governmental anointing across nations who've been trained on the bears and the lions. He's calling those who know the Lord of hosts to fight in his name and to stand with Israel, calling on the spiritual Anzacs of Australia to stand with Israel at this critical time. My guest in Bendigo today is Stan Goodenough, who was with us in April of 2024. He's an evangelical journalist who served with the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem. Since 2011, he's been a tour guide in Israel and speaker to nations. Originally from South Africa, Stan and his wife have been in Israel for 36 years, somewhere there. And they have 7 Jerusalem-born children. The 3 oldest have served in the IDF and are Israeli citizens. Welcome back, Stan. Welcome back.
Thank you, Ruth. It's good to be here.
And thank you for sharing with us again in this city to stir us and challenge us. Now, last time you were here, October the 7th just happened. And there were some nasty incidents of chanting against Israel in Australia, which we were shocked about. And you challenged us with the question, will Israel be abandoned and betrayed again? And we chatted about that. Currently, we are heartbroken at the change in Australia with worsening anti-Semitism, the fire bombings of synagogue, the nurses, doctors, etc., all of those things. And we've been told that it's just the tip of the iceberg, that what we've seen. We're in shock, and I know Israel is disturbed what they've heard because they're ringing relatives in Australia saying, "Are you okay?" And you spoke in our meeting about some making plans to leave. Since your last visit 12 months ago, or nearly, not quite, and your many visits here, could you sum up your observation and assessment of where we are as a country?
Thank you, Ruth. I will do so in answer to your question, with the hope that the listeners, that our listeners will hear my heart as I speak, and that because the story is not a pretty one, that the reason that I believe I'm here is to encourage a reassessment and, with God's help, speak to turning Australia back into alignment with the nation of Israel, where this country has stood in the past. My first visit here was in 2014, and back then I would say that you had one of the most Israel-supportive governments, both in the Prime Minister Tony Abbott and his Foreign Minister Julie Bishop, who, in a sense, really went against the rest of the international community and supported Israel's right to their existence, to their secure presence in their land, and did not support the idea of dividing that land into 2 states. Even Jewish settlement in the areas the world calls the West Bank, but which we know for many centuries as Judea and Samaria, which the world says is illegal. The Abbott government said no, it's not illegal, and so did your Anyway, a number of members of your government back then. But then things began to shift, even though the following two administrations were also on that same side of the political spectrum. Nonetheless, they began to move the country more into seemingly trying to find a middle ground where Australia wouldn't seem to be so overtly, perhaps, on the side of in support of Israel. And then under the current government, of course, the country has moved quite radically to supporting people that are in fact committed to Israel's destruction. And quite quickly after the ascent of this current government, the repositioning of Australia vis-a-vis Israel in general, even before October the 7th, the massacre of that day, Australia was, under the current government, was moving into a more into increasingly hostile position towards Israel and supportive and more alliance with those who are Israel's enemies. So things have shifted quite radically, and of course, as you've referred to, the anti-Semitism that has really erupted, I think, from almost nothing, relatively hardly any news-making events about acts of Jew hatred to becoming a daily occurrence here, and increasingly shocking expressions of anti-Semitism that have put fear into the heart of Australia's Jews, that have upset many Australians who understand the evil of anti-Semitism and want to distance themselves from it. But it's brought Australia now to a place where Israel at least regards Australia, sadly, as more of an enemy than a friend.
It's really sad to hear you say that Israel sees us as an enemy, not a friend, where our history has been that we've been such allies. You also said about meeting Holocaust survivors in Australia, how traumatised they are. What is it that they're picking up?
Well, what you did in Australia, to your full credit, was that pretty much from the beginning of the last century, the attitude here was philo-Semitic. It was friendly towards Jewish people. It supported and helped facilitate the Zionism, the nationalism of the Jewish people to return to their land, and that was the direction things went. There were a couple of hiccups. There was one point where Australia closed its doors to Jews trying to flee the Holocaust, and that was a blot on your copybook. But apart from that, pretty much all the way down the years, all the way through both world wars and into the modern era post Israel's independence, Australia has been a friend of Israel's, and that's your legacy, which now is in fact being soiled by an attitude that is so very different, and that almost seems to have identified any support for Israel as actually being support for colonization and even for genocide.
That's the worrying thing that's there. And for our listeners, this is for the Christian audience that should have read their Bibles. Israel is a big story. The Bible is the history of Israel. To the Jewish audience, where the Judeo-Christian is the foundation. Where do you see for the Christian community, that we've got away from the Bible's central part of who Israel is?
Well, the very sad, tragic fact is that not that long after the time of Christ, within 150 years, people who would eventually become known as the Church Fathers, they took what Jesus came to teach and how he lived and how the disciples lived and their message, and they institutionalized it, and they actually ripped it away from its Jewish origins, and they really formed a new religion, the Christianity that became mainstream Christendom after mid-2nd century. If you see Christianity as a broad river running down through 2,000 years, most of that river has been going down the channel that says that the Jews are no longer relevant to God, that they have been replaced by the church, and so their their significance is now past, and any reference in the Bible to Israel we now take as Christians and as the church, and we take that to ourselves if they're blessings, at least, not the curses, of course. And that is sadly across Australia, across my country, South Africa, and America, everywhere. Most people who go to church have no comprehension or interest in Israel whatsoever, even though their Bibles are all about Israel, and God calls himself the God of Israel. And the beginning and the middle and the end of the story centers on the little land of Israel and the city of Jerusalem. Most Christians do their Christian thing, disconnected from all of that, and in some kind of spiritual pie-in-the-sky reality, which is just disconnected from it all. That's the sad reality.
It is a sad thing, and yet when you disconnect from the reality of it, you start seeing things in the wrong prism of your eyes, which ends up with bad decisions being made.
Especially if you have an arrogance, if you think that, the Jews, as they say, the Jews rejected Christ or killed Christ. Now, so they deserve what's coming to them. We are now the special people. We are now the chosen ones. And there is an arrogance. There's a presumption, and we warned very strongly by Paul in his letter to the Romans that we think that we are safe in our salvation if we take a stand against Israel. No, God can actually cut us out of our place in his kingdom.
Very severe warnings. We're going to listen to Paul Wilbur singing Arise, O Lord, which is really needed at this moment. Paul Wilbur's Arise, O Lord.
But for the sake of brevity now, I can just say this, that when Israel began along this road, they had a hope that it would work. And so there was some support for the two-state solution. That support was radically eroded in the Second Intifada between 2000 and 2004. As a direct result of them offering land, they got more terrorism than they'd ever had up until that point. And then the process continued, and Israel would eventually relinquish the whole of the Gaza Strip and hand it over to the Palestinian Arabs, who turned it into a base for terrorism, and ultimately we launched the October 7th, 2023 attack from there. And so the Jewish people have come to realize, after 30 years at least of being willing to offer land for peace, to come up with the two-state solution for it to work, that it doesn't work. Not only that it doesn't work, but it has put them at a terrible disadvantage, and it has actually become an existential threat to them. So now in Israel, pretty much nobody supports the two-state solution, but everyone in the world now insists, all world leaders insist that the two-state solution is the only way to go. And now we're heading to the conference you just mentioned on the 2nd of June this year, when the international community is basically going to say to Israel, shut up, it's got nothing to do with you, we're deciding there will be a two-state solution, and if you don't want to comply, then we will use force, foreign forces if necessary, but we will it will be the global international consensus that we go to the two-state solution. And the Jewish people know, in Israel they know, the two-state solution spells the destruction of Israel. So the whole world is now actually aligned with or complicit in an action, a movement, a direction that the Jewish people know, without doubt, will lead to their destruction. They're convinced of it. And the rest of the world can stand on their head. They're not going to change how the Jewish people feel, because they're not basing it on imagination. They're basing it on the awful massacre and everything horrible that happened on October the 7th and everything that's happened since then. So we come to Australia, which is under a government which until now, in fact, in Australia, all the political parties support this two-state solution. But Israel has actually appealed to the world to repudiate it, to reject it. And very specifically to your parliamentarians here in Australia, members of the Israeli Knesset have written and communicated their request, their petition to Australian leadership to repudiate the two-state solution. Don't go down that road. However, all the political parties here are still in support of it, and so we're at a very critical moment in Australian history when the nation will decide, pretty much at the upcoming federal election, who they put into office, and whoever they put into office will either go with the two-state solution or will be challenged by the voters to drop it, so that Israel will feel that Australia, at least along perhaps with Donald Trump's America, is an ally that will stand with them and secure them against this threat.
And biblically, dividing the land comes with a terrible price to the nations that do it.
Yes, biblically, throughout the Bible, the warnings that God gives to the nations who come against Israel in whatever way, shape, or form, but specifically those who put their hand to trying to divide the land. And many nations have done this in the past. Other nations that were once great empires divided up the land, and they no longer exist. But in the present political reality in the 21st century, yes, the division of the land, which the nations are now pretty much locked into, and they almost can't get out of, is something that God says, and if we believe His word and we believe what He says, is something that's going to bring these nations, our nations, South Africa, that's my nation, Australia, your nation, if they go that way, they're going to come into direct conflict with God. And He has spelled out how He will treat the nations if they go down that road. And it's not a pretty story.
As you said in the meeting, the cup that Israel's been drinking will be poured out on the nations that do this.
Yes, it's a good Bible study to do for any of your readers who enjoy digging into Scripture. Follow the trail of what God calls the cup of His wrath, or the cup of His vengeance. The fact that the Jews have suffered for for as long as they have, God says because of their unfaithfulness in the past, they've been drinking from that cup. And their suffering has been off the charts for so many centuries. But He says that He's going to take that cup out of the hands of the people of Israel and put it into the hands of Australians, South Africans, Americans, Spanish, everybody else. And He's going to make those nations drink. And they're going to experience something even worse, if it's possible to conceive this, than what the Jews have had to go through for the last 2,000 years, which has been over and over again attempts to annihilate them. It means you're talking about 2/3 of the Jews who were killed in World War I. And then you go read in the book of Revelation, and when God says He pours out His bowls of wrath on the Gentile nations, and 2/3 of the people of the world die. So we're talking about a most unbelievably severe response from God, specifically related not to all the other things we're concerned about in our nations, like morality and transgenderism and all these other things, but specifically because of the way that our nations have treated the people of God, the Jewish people, and the land of Israel. And so anybody who believes in the Bible, anybody who has fear of the Lord in them should really be contemplating what it is that their country is supporting and what they can do to stop it if it's going down that road.
Because in that same passage it talks about multitudes in the valley of decision, and really Australia is at a point of decision at a very critical time right now in these things. It's like that passage, isn't it? The valley of decision.
Exactly. Joel chapter 3, the nations are gathered together and they are judged by God, specifically as far as pertaining to how they treated Jews and how they treated the land. And then God says He puts them in His wine press and He crushes them out. And we read elsewhere that the vengeance that God carries out on the nations for what He calls the controversy of Zion. It's scary, to be honest. It's frank. It's a warning that should galvanize anyone who has fear of God into action.
I was going to say, it puts the fear of the Lord into you, doesn't it, to consider these weighty matters in light of those scriptures that we've often just overlooked in the church because we haven't seen that as you rightly say, there's not an Old Testament, it's just one Bible, because it's one scripture, and we often overlook some of these passages, but they're coming into the forefront of our history right now, aren't they?
Yes, they are. And basically we're on a collision course with those prophecies, and that's where we are.
So that raises the question then, if we're in the valley of decision, and this is a challenge to Christians, you've come out here to really address this challenge that we're in, this valley of decision. A lot of Christians don't like to talk politics, but we do have an election coming up. What should Christians do? What can we do? Yes, we need to pray, absolutely, because it is a spiritual battle. But there are probably some practical things in your mind that our listeners can do.
First of all, to just precursor anything I say with what is important for me to communicate is that this is your election, this is your nation, it has to do with your choices. And I'm not an Australian, and I'm from outside. And so what I do share here, I share because I have an affinity with Australia, an interest in an appreciation of Australia, and an awareness of your legacy. So there, and I believe there is what to do, and I think it boils down to, I wrote an article which was published in the Christians for Israel newspaper a couple of weeks ago, based off the campaign statement by an American who was I think he was helping Bill Clinton to run in the elections, and there were a lot of issues going on that voters were all caught up in, and he coined the term, "It's the economy, stupid." Basically, what he was saying was everything else is irrelevant. Focus on the economy. And the article that I just had published was called "It's the two-state solution, stupid."
Yeah.
From a spiritual point of view, this issue is more important than all the other issues that you're battling on here. All the other issues, because God's blessing will come if this nation stands right with regard to Israel, but the shadow of the enemy will lengthen as as Australia moves into opposition to what God is doing there. So there is what to do, and Christians in democracies all have access to the people who represent them.
Yeah.
There's petitioning, there's polling, there's going to meet with people to express a conviction, a Christian conviction. We do not want Australia to support the two-state solution. We don't want Australia to be in any way involved in something that all the evidence that we have seen and that Israel has seen poses an existential threat to the Jewish people. God forbid that Australia would do anything that would endanger this nation, which time and again has come so close to being wiped out, and now is standing again at the edge of a precipice and sees that the world is wanting to push it over that cliff, which is the cliff of the two-state solution. The Jewish people know the two-state solution means the destruction of Israel. The state of Palestine is a weapon designed to destroy Israel. They know it. Now they're looking for some people in this world who really care about Israel and really want to have that relationship to take a stand. And I think for the voters in Australia have a choice. They can take a stand on this issue, even though it's not a major issue in Australia. But from heaven's perspective, it is, I would argue, the ultimate issue.
I've been just watching since October the 7th. It's interesting, in all the newscasts, Israel is in the headlines all the time. And the Palestinians, this whole issue is there front and centre because of the terrorist attacks and no doubt all the horrors of it. I just wonder, do you think it's possible that the whole Israel issue actually becomes a major issue in the election?
Well, it certainly became a major issue in the election of the United States when right up to the moment that Donald Trump walked into the Oval Office, him and his advisors and his staff were pushing for the release of hostages held by Hamas.
That's right, yeah.
And right up until Joe Biden was pushed out of the Oval Office, him and his advisors were trying to be the ones who would be the heroes who brought the first hostages home. And Donald Trump won that battle, but it did. It became the main issue in the transition between the Biden administration and the Trump administration. It's been an issue here in the past. It has had different levels of priority it's been given, but it has been an issue here in the past. And I think because of where things in Israel could still go, I mean, we're not heading towards peace. We're heading towards an intensification of this war. This story is far from over. Yeah. And Australia will have to take a stand on this story, and it can become a bigger issue here, but I don't know if it will happen before the elections, which are just around the corner.
Yeah. Although just a few days ago from this recording, there was an anti-Semitism summit held in Sydney where it's bringing the issues to the surface. So in some areas it can be. So I'm just wondering if Christians really got the fear of the Lord in them on this issue, like what you're saying, I wonder if the prayer and the action would actually lift it into the place of the debate in the public square.
Well, I did bring with me a letter from the Knesset in Jerusalem, and signed by 8 members of the parliament there, of 8 different political parties. And they appealed to Australia to do 2 things. To crack down on anti-Semitism, and for the sake of Australian Jewry that is now living in fear because of this Jew hatred, and to rescind support, to end support for the two-state solution. And these members of Knesset said, if Australia's leaders would do that, then the breach between Australia and Israel would be mended, and the nations could come back into alignment. So that is a critical issue from that perspective, and I do believe it has a spiritual underpinning as well.
Yeah. So, you mentioned President Trump coming into the office, and he then recently spoke about his plan for Gaza. which of course would really cut into the two-state solution aspect. Some think he's crazy, some think it's out of the box. What's your understanding of what he's suggesting? I know nothing's in print yet, and there's a lot of talk about it, but when you look at what he's proposing, how do you see that in terms of the two-state solution and what God said is the land for Israel?
I'm going to come at your question from a slightly different angle, if I may, Ruth.
Sure.
So what Donald Trump did was it was a brilliant move. He exposed the glaring hypocrisy of the international community. Everybody who is falling over backwards to express concern, anxiety, compassion, horror of what Israel is doing to the Palestinian Arabs. Just a few short years ago, Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine.
That's right, yeah.
Millions of Ukrainians had to flee to get out of the way of Putin's rockets and his forces. And all of Europe opened up their arms to welcome in Ukrainian refugees. They settled them, they sponsored them, they put them in school. They did so much for them. This cause, the Palestinian cause, for which the whole world is constantly shedding crocodile tears over the plight of these poor people, and their plight is real. But the Western world is shot through with hypocrisy. Not one nation has opened its borders and said, well, we'll take them in. We'll take them in and let the war finish, and then they can go back and we can rebuild. Not one of them. And especially not the states, Jordan and Egypt right next door, who are Arab states who speak the language, who have lots of room, who would get billions of dollars from the international community and the Arab world to settle these people. They go on and on and on about how awful the existence of the Palestinians is, but there's not the slightest shred of interest or effort to help these people, to really help them. And Donald Trump basically exposed that. And yes, the words he used caused people to kind of freak out. But the fact is, he put his finger on it. He said, we need to get them out of there. And he did not say, we're going to force them out at gunpoint. He said they need to be allowed to leave.
Yeah.
We need them to move out. The place is a trash heap, but they need to move out. So the place can be rebuilt. In the meantime, they can be resettled, like Ukrainians have been, allowed to go to university, start work, become part of those nations. They are refugees after all, and nations should be open to accepting refugees. So I think it was a stroke of genius. I think the hysterical response of the progressive left woke world just shows exactly how far they are from really caring about the Palestinian Arabs. They don't give a fig for the Palestinian Arabs. They just hate Israel. Yeah. And that's what's driving them.
Yeah. Some have said that the land's been promised. Gaza has been part of the allocated land for the Jewish people. Do you think the Jewish people see it as that, or the pressure of the international community is too tough on them?
Pressure is massive and always has been on Israel, and as long as Israel looks to America or anyone else for their primary support rather than looking to the Almighty, which many of them do, but many of them don't, there will be this kind of pressure. But yes, Gaza, most of Gaza is part of the inheritance of the tribe of Judah.
Yeah.
And it certainly has archaeological evidence of Israelite presence in the past, as there's almost everywhere in the land of Israel. So they do have a biblical claim to the land. They have a historical claim to the land. And in recent history, they've taken that land, which is just pure, sea sand, and they've made it one of the most productive places in Israel, producing some of the best fruit and veg, sending millions of cut flowers to the markets. They made it work. And they, in fact, handed the Palestinian Arabs all of that. And all they did was trash it and burn it and turn it
build tunnels.
And build tunnels,
Yeah. We're going to listen to Paul Wilbur sing Draw Me, Lord, as you contemplate these deep matters. My guest today is Stan Goodenough, who's a tour guide now in Israel. His background is in journalism. And we're talking on the two-state solution and all the things that we're seeing with the rise of anti-Semitism. Now, in Australia and around the world, since October the 7th, instead of countries supporting Israel, we've seen all these massive protests break out, the pro-Palestinian. And you referred to the Palestinian people a moment ago, but most people don't realise who they are, where the cause has started, the fact that the word Palestine, though it is in most people's Bible maps, is actually not a country, nor is there a Palestinian people. It's a big subject and people might get upset, but we just because it's always in our face in the news, it's a good question to ask somebody like yourself who's from the area, who knows the history of it, where it's come from. Why is it such an issue?
All right, pencils and paper ready, because this is going to be bullet point.
Yep.
Okay. Palestine, or Philistia in its original language, the name given to the land of Judea by the Roman Emperor Hadrian as he erased it. Palestine from that day in 125 AD until 1948, Palestine was an area. It was a region. It was part of other empires that came and went. It was never a state on its own, never a country. And the people who came and went, the nomads who came and went, and the Jews who came and went, and there were always Jews living there, Palestinian did not refer to their nationality, but simply to identify where they lived. It was not a national.
It's in a region.
Yeah, exactly. They lived in the province of Palestine, for the short version. So it is an absolute fact to say that there never has been a Palestinian state. If one is created, it will be a brand new thing.
Yeah.
And until 1964, nobody called themselves the Palestinian nation. So from then to now, okay, there are Arabs who call themselves Palestinians. So we can say, okay, you can call yourselves Palestinians, but your origins began in 1964, whereas the Jews' origins began in 3000 BC. Yeah. Okay, so there we go. Now, Palestinian nationalism. It's born right after World War I, in the last days of World War I, when the world changes from a place where there are colonies that are approved of to the new watchword, which is self-determination. People living everywhere are given a chance to determine what nation they want to be, and they form new nations. And so the Middle East, after the Ottoman Empire was destroyed, was wiped out in World War I, the Middle East became a new jigsaw puzzle, and a lot of new states were created. They were all brand new: Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan. And even Egypt and even Saudi Arabia are new nation states today. They're not the Syria of the Bible. They're not the Lebanon of the Bible. It's the same place, different people, different nation. So they're all new nation states. In this new nationalism is born what today we would call Palestinian nationalism. I'm going to run the timeline on it very quickly. It begins in the same year as the light horse charge Beersheba.
Yeah.
And where the light horse charge in Beersheba would help to facilitate the Jews' return to their land and ultimately their declaration of independence, at the same time the Palestinian nationalist cause was born, and its purpose was to prevent the creation of the State of Israel. So while on the one side of the Jews who were immigrating into the country, you had Australians as part of the British Empire that through the wars and in different ways helped to bring about to settle these Jews and bring them to a place where they could call themselves once again a state. At the same time, there was this other movement, this other nationalism, Palestinian nationalism. It was born in violence. Its purpose was to its modus operandi was massacres and pogroms, and its purpose was to prevent, by all means, as bloodily as possible, the coming of the rebirth of Israel. The first years of Palestinian nationalism were headed up by a cleric in the Muslim world called Husseini, who stoked the violence and then went off to Adolf Hitler and asked Adolf Hitler to work with him to actually destroy the Jews that were living in the area of Palestine. Yeah. He failed, and Israel was born. Israel was born in war, and with its birth, the Arab states vowed that they would erase her. In order to do that, Egypt formed the Palestine Liberation Organization. This now becomes the channel of Palestinian nationalism. But nobody in the world cares about the Palestinians because they're not a people. They don't exist. They're refugees, and there's lots of refugees in the world. Who cares about them? So the leadership of this new organization, the PLO, which is an umbrella group over a number of other Palestinian groups, they decide, okay, we're going to use violence to get the international community to wake up to the fact that we have been dispossessed of our land, which is a lie, and that the Palestinian refugees are living in a plight that they need to be saved out of and given back their land, which is also a lie because it wasn't their land to start with. How they did it by violence. They did it by international terrorism. They introduced the world to international terrorism, which today we know about because of 9/11. We know about it because of these things. The Palestinians taught the world international terrorism, and they used airplane hijackings and the murder of Olympic athletes and so on and so on. They used violence to get the world to wake up to the fact that, the Palestinians are a people, they have a cause, and they've been unjustly treated, they're the underdog, let's begin to support them. So directly as a consequence of decades of violence, the international community began to birth a kind of a pro-Palestinian ethos.
Sort of a compassion.
Sort of a compassion alone. We can take that apart,
yes.
as I mentioned earlier about the Arabs of Gaza. So this is the timeline of Palestinian nationalism, which will eventually lead to the Oslo Agreement, will eventually lead to the two-state solutions, the formula for the two-state solution, and will eventually, in fact, lead to the October the 7th massacre. The massacre could only happen because Israel had given them land.
Yes,
Israel gave them land so they could build a state, so there could be peace. But instead, they used that land to carry out the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust. And so the Jewish people now know that this Palestinian nationalism, which the whole world champions, all the nations of the world, virtually without exception, they believe that the Palestinians are a people, that they have national rights to that land. And when Barack Obama was president at the very end of his final term in office, he allowed the Security Council to pass an international resolution, a binding resolution, that says that the Gaza Strip, Judea and Samaria, which they call the West Bank, and half of Jerusalem, that these are OPT, these are occupied Palestinian territories. That's the official designation. It means they belong to the Palestinians. Israel is occupying them, and the international community is going to use everything at its disposal to get the Jews out of there and to birth Palestine. And Palestine, as I've alluded to already, Palestine, which will be on the high ground, looking out down over Tel Aviv, from which they can launch their rockets and launch many other October 7th attacks, is an existential threat to Israel. So if Australia supports the Palestinian national cause by recognizing Palestine and promoting the two-state solution, Australia will then be coming alongside one of the most blood-soaked, murderous movements in history and giving them some kind of huge reward for all the years of mayhem and massacring and everything else that they have done. Palestinian nationalism is evil from the beginning to the end. They have no legitimate claim, they have no national history, they have no rights, and the entire world, virtually today, champions their cause. What a sick world we live in. If they really think that these people who are parading these hostages, who are putting out coffins of butchered baby boys and all this stuff, that they should be supported, that somehow there's something there that has some good, some value, that they should put their money and their politics and behind. No, we are in a very, very evil world, and the hatred is all directed at the Jews, the people that God calls his own. So if you've got spiritual eyes to see, you understand who's on whose side here and where the evil really lies.
Because God calls Israel the apple of his eye. He calls them very differently to what the world calls them. For those that have not been to Israel, what we're talking about with the dividing of the land, with the two-state solution, even at the moment, the width of Israel is very small. We're talking about the hills of Israel are the high places, which would be part of it. Just describe for those that have not been to the land why it is so geographically a threat if terrorists are, right there sharing the land with you.
So let me counsel you. Hit the pause button now as you're listening to this and go and quickly get a map of Israel. Just grab one anywhere. One that shows the so-called West Bank and Gaza. Get your atlas, get a map, whatever, get it and put it in front of you. And then have a look. And the area that's called the West Bank, that would be Palestine. And the area that's called Gaza, you'll see at the bottom. And then you'll see that they have to connect those two pieces of land. The whole of the area called the West Bank is the mountains of Israel. And then between them and the Mediterranean Sea is a corridor 13 miles wide. 13 miles wide. You can see the other side of what would be left of Israel if Palestine is created in the mountains. You understand that Israel becomes indefensible. That there's no way Israel survives a state of Palestine. There is no way. Not from every aspect that you look at it. It's immoral. It's militarily bankrupt. There's no security for Israel in it. And it's against God's word. In every way, shape, and form, the creation of Palestine in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, or the West Bank and Gaza, is just there's no way that Israel survives it. There's no way that Israel survives it. And we have decades of evidence and decades of spilled Jewish blood to prove it. But get a map and see it for yourself, because you really should.
Yeah, but the flat maps don't show the mountains in those areas.
So take it from me that where it says the West Bank, that's the mountains, and between there and the sea, it's flat. It's zero.
And we know that if you're in the mountains, you've got the high place, and so the people in the lowlands are at their disposal. And just a few days ago, we saw this horrendous attack. Thankfully, intervened, where they had all these bombs to go off in the buses and the light train And they were from, I understand, Judea, Samaria, in that area, these terrorists, which is just another example, because they wanted another October 7th.
Yes, according to what we've read, and I haven't seen all evidence to it,
Yes.
but according to what we read, from Tulkarm, which is one of the towns in Judea, Samaria, came terrorists, and we have CCTV footage of them, one of them getting on the bus and deciding where to put his bomb, and the bombs went off on some of the buses, but most of the buses were empty, or in one case at least, passengers saw it and said, everybody get off, and they got off and the bus exploded. There could have been hundreds of casualties. There was enough explosive there. And again, according to reports which I cannot yet verify, the plan was that with this mayhem and a few other components attached to it, that Arabs in Judea and Samaria would do what the Arabs in Gaza did, and they'd break through from the so-called West Bank, and they'd come in and they'd kill and rape and take hostage
And kidnap, and
everything that they did. Because it works for them.
Yeah.
It always works for them.
Yeah.
Kill Jews and the world supports you. I mean, how sick this is.
Yeah. And it's unbelievable. It's heartbreaking. I know you've said that it's hard to put into words what Israel has gone through since October the 7th, and just this week with those children being returned. It's hard for us to really understand the depth of evil, except for, it says in Genesis 6, when before the flood, the Lord said the heart of man was so evil, he wanted to destroy the earth.
Can I come back at you with something positive?
Yeah, please do.
I have a friend who lives up in Shiloh, where the tabernacle once stood. His name is Natirom, and he has a big family of kids. He's an Orthodox. He's a settler, one of the Jews the world hates. Okay, he's got his peyot and his kippah and I interviewed him some months back now, and I asked him. I said, Nati, how do you raise your Jewish kids? You know, you got to raise them with the history of your nation. So you're going to have to tell them that down through history, they've always actually been in danger. And different people have gone after them and tried to kill them, from Pharaoh to Haman to Hadrian to Hitler, and in between everything else. So how do you raise your children in a world that so hates them, and you raise them and you keep them from having nightmares and growing up in fear and terror? And he said, we don't teach our children about all the people that try to kill us. We teach our children about all the times God saved us from the people who try to kill us. And God always saves them, but the road is extremely painful. And I think we as Christians, we need to understand just how awful a price it is. The people who are called God's chosen people, to be chosen, this is the price that they've had to pay.
I love that they teach them all the times God saved them. And we certainly saw that the other day with the buses and all these other situations where God has saved them from out of the jaws of total defeat. Even October the 7th, they said they were going to do the same from Lebanon. So it's a really good thing for our listeners to go back and look at the scriptures of the times God has delivered his people. Thank you, Stan, for coming to Australia. Thank you for coming to Bendigo. Thank you for sharing with us and stirring us to really realise the fear of God, of how important this issue is, to stir us at this critical time in our history, that we would be on the right side of history, the right side with God's history and God's people. And we bless you as you go across our land to stir us afoot. Thank you.
Thank you.